Welcome to The Paradox with your attending, Dr. Eric Larson. He is a practicing anesthesiologist and clinical assistant professor at Michigan State University College of Human Medicine. Listen in as he takes you behind the scenes of what practicing medicine in today's ever-changing world is like with another doctor. The Paradox is a fun and accidentally informative show for physicians, patients, or anyone who has ever found themselves in a waiting room.
Welcome back to The Paradox. I'm here with Jay Bhattacharya. He was back on episode 134, which actually back in June 24th of 2021. It doesn't, like I was saying before, it doesn't feel like it's been that long, but COVID really distorts your reality of time. The space-time continuum is all messed up with the epidemic.
Yeah, it's good to be back, Eric. I can't believe it's been almost a year.
Yeah. So, well, a few things have changed since we last spoke. Fortunately, the pandemic has ended. People they have returned to rationality. Science is now engaged in honest discussions and discourse, right? Academia has totally flipped on its head. Yeah, sadly, none of those things have happened, right? That's the joke, right? So I mean, one of the things we talked about last episode was the fact that we were worried about science and just the discourse, and I guess talk about what your feeling has been since we last spoke a year ago.
So since we spoke last, there's been a few developments about how government bureaucrats, prominent people like Tony Fauci, handled dissent when he was faced with it. All right. So just to give your listeners a timeline, in October of 2020, Sunetra Gupta, Martin Kulldorff, and I wrote the Great Barrington Declaration. That was the proposal to essentially for younger people to open up society because the lockdowns were harming them more than COVID was, schools especially. Whereas for older people to adopt more measures of focused protection for the elderly, because COVID is a deadly disease for the elderly. So we wrote this hoping to engage the scientific community in a discussion about how to do focused protection, and also to bring attention to the problems of the collateral damage caused by lockdowns. Instead, Eric, what we were met with was this absolute wall of hostility from both the press and also the mainstream scientific establishment. I started getting reporters asking me why I wanted to let the virus rip, people accusing me of being a eugenicist, even though I want to protect the vulnerable old, which is a strange thing for a eugenicist to want to do, I guess. Anyways, it was the weirdest thing, and just hostile attacks from both inside the university and outside, and I was blown away. I mean, I knew it would be controversial, but I didn't expect it to have this sort of crazed expulsion from polite society. What happened since is that there were a series of people who made FOIA requests. FOIA is a Freedom of Information Act request to the federal government, trying to figure out what happened. Like what were Tony Fauci and Francis Collins, who's the head of the NIH, saying around the time when they saw the Great Barrington Declaration. So it turns out there was an email from Francis Collins to Tony Fauci 4 days after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, literally 4 days. In it, he wrote that there were 3 fringe epidemiologists, me, Sunetra Gupta, who's probably the world's best epidemiologist at Oxford University, and Martin Kulldorff, who's then a biostatistician at Harvard University and an epidemiologist, designed the vaccine safety surveillance systems that would play a big part in that for the FDA. He called us fringe epidemiologists, and I think I'm gonna put it on my business card someday.
Your Twitter bio, right? Fringe epidemiologist.
I think I should put that on there. He also called for a devastating published takedown of the premises. 4 days. He didn't contact me. He didn't want to talk with me. He just called, asked, and Tony Fauci responded with a link to a Wired magazine article that was published around that time, completely misunderstanding the proposal. What I think what happened was that they viewed, Tony Fauci and Francis Collins viewed the Great Barrington Declaration as a threat to the idea that there was a consensus in favor of lockdown, a scientific consensus in favor of lockdown. When you have 3 people from places like Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford saying, look, the lockdowns are a grave mistake. I mean, you kind of need to take it seriously, but they didn't take that seriously. Instead, they sought to destroy us, destroy the idea, put us on the fringe. And they used the media, their links to the media and to big tech to try to attempt to censor us, deplatform us. And it was something else to go through. I mean, it was a very stressful time for me. But I think the key thing is to understand why it matters for policy more broadly than for me, is that you cannot have government scientists, essentially government bureaucrats, falsely claiming a scientific consensus that does not exist. Tens of thousands of scientists signed the Great Barrington Declaration. Tens of thousands of doctors signed the Great Barrington Declaration. Almost 1 million people have signed it. It's very far from the lockdowns were then and now very far from a consensus. And it was it was an attempt to create this false sense of consensus, to use the enormous power they have over the minds of scientists and also the media and the big tech in order to create this illusion of consensus.
Yeah, it was pretty stunning, because I think, I grew up in the 90s, and so there was definitely a political correctness, I guess you'd say, wave or on campus. And it was sort of not joked about, but it was kind of silly. But when you go to campus, there were all kinds of different speakers who come. I was at University of Michigan, very liberal campus, and we had all kinds of people spouting crazy things. And there were occasionally there were shout downs, but for the most part, there was engagement. There's at least a discussion. And yeah, maybe you think someone's a kook, but you just, you'd at least express it to them and tell them they're a kook, as opposed to have third parties, do this sort of behind the scenes and squelch this debate. Because I think, we talked about before, I think the academic institutions is really where the biggest problem is in some respects, because that is where you expect to have this debate. You expect to have a discussion for a couple hours between 10 prominent epidemiologists or whomever, and sort of hash these things out and at least have an idea of what the consensus is. Because likely you don't ever approach true consensus, but you may find things that are inside or outside the bounds, and you at least have the opportunity for other academics to look at these discussions, listen to them, and say, draw their own conclusions based on what they know, right? That seems like that's how the academy, so to speak, used to work. And my impression is this is new. Like, I don't think this happened before COVID. Like when we were talking about AIDS, we were talking about, this is a long time ago, but even other discussions, it doesn't seem like this was a sort of the route to approach consensus with any sort of thing. Maybe it happens in professional societies like cardiologists or so. I don't know. Is that accurate? Because it just feels like this is just a totally, it's almost like the rules were changed and no one really knew about it except the people who were orchestrating this sort of behind the scenes, like you mentioned, Fauci and Collins.
I think, so let me talk a little bit about like in particular why this is such a conflict of interest, like what they did. Fauci and Collins, they sit on $45 billion of budget,
right,
that goes to scientists biomedical scientists all across the country, actually all across the world. But it's not just the money. In order to advance in academic medicine, you really do need an NIH grant. An NIH grant is a marker itself of a success, and many academic institutions require a big NIH grant in order to get tenure. So it's not just that you can't do your research because you can't get the money. It's your entire social standing within science itself depends on NIH research money. And so when the head of the NIH engages in behavior like this, he's sending a signal to the world at large. Tony Fauci is sending a signal to the scientists in particular that if they step out of line, they're going to be just, boy, that's a nice career you have there. It'd be terrible if something were to happen to it. So it's a deep conflict of interest. And you asked, is this new? I'm not sure it's new, actually, Eric. Because during COVID, I think I've seen this happen in at least 3 different areas where Tony Fauci used his power and leverage to deem academic discussion about various aspects of COVID policy out of bounds. I think the most prominent of this is actually not even us. It's the discussion over the lab origins. the virus. Like, is it lab origin? Is it natural origin? In FOIA emails, there were a whole series of these where from like February 2020, where Tony Fauci organized a group of virologists. He asked a group of virologists that basically in his inner circle to come together in it looks to me like a small cabal. They came in. They asked. They several of them before the meetings that Tony Fauci arranged. Basically said that it's a 50-50 shot. It could be either lab leak or natural origins. They're not sure. They came out of that meeting all saying that they believed it was a conspiracy theory to say it was a lab leak. And then they wrote a letter that the Lancet published, essentially calling the lab leak a conspiracy. So for a full year, prominent scientists who thought it was a lab leak. Now, I'm not qualified to tell. I'm not a molecular biologist, but it looks to. I mean, what I can say is that this looks like a cover-up. You had a group of people who used their power to marginalize people who thought it was a lab leak, and frankly, it just looks really suspicious to me. They did that then they did that again with the lockdowns, as we just discussed, and they also did that with the possibility of early treatment. So they marginalized anyone who thought that early treatment with repurposed drugs was even possible. Ironically, Tony Fauci's NIAID actually is running a trial on ivermectin and fluvoxamine that are due to be done in March 2023. But like, and there are people that like doctors, someone like Peter McCullough, who has a long career in medicine, saying that these early treatments are possible, that we should be evaluating them quickly. I mean, that's not a conspiracy theory. That's just like, he may be right or may be wrong, but he belongs in the conversation. He doesn't belong on the fringe. So I think I've seen this at least 3 times in the context of COVID. And this has a long and sordid history. Like, so if you go back to the Soviet Union, there was a scientist named Lysenko. Lysenko was a geneticist, but he didn't believe in Mendelian genetics. Stalin loved him because Lysenko promised crop yields that were going to be massive. All you have to do is expose the crops to some harsh conditions. They evolve in the context, in one generation, and then they pass on what they learn to their offspring. This probably killed, I don't know how many people from starvation in the Soviet Union. All of the Mendelian geneticists were purged one by one by Lysenko. Many died. I mean, this is not something to play around with. Science needs to have free discussion. It needs to be. You cannot have government bureaucrats with a tremendous power over the minds and careers of scientists playing the kind of role that Tony Fauci and Francis Collins played.
I think it's easy to point out that Fauci has been in office, I guess his office, since 1984 in heading the NIAID. That's almost 40 years. That's a long time, obviously. And so he has built up credentials. He's built up contacts within the media, tech industry, everywhere within government. And he uses those. I mean, there's no question. I mean, he is a politician, and I think it's easy for us to say, well, he's a scientist, et cetera. And yes, he is those things, but he's absolutely a politician, because you cannot survive in government that long, both Democratic and Republican administrations, last 40 years, and not be a political animal in many respects, right? So you have to be able to play it. And so you turn those, you sort of turn in your chips when you need them. And I think this is certainly an opportunity. And maybe to your point that the industry has been like this, it's just, we don't see it because it's not in the public. No one ever really knows what's going on in research. People who are contrarians a little bit in climate science have definitely made these assertions that there's, if you're not towing the party line, whatever that might be, that you're going to feel that in funding through NIH, or in that case, it would be the, is it at national NAOSS, I think, the National Atmospheric Oceanic Services.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think in some ways, maybe you see the same phenomena, and maybe it's just that we just didn't, it was never public, but now it has been brought to the forefront. And to your point, of course, it may not have been a lab leak. It might've been natural origins. Early treatment might not work at all. It might be a scam, right? It might just be like giving lemonade to people. All these things are possible, but the counterfactuals are entirely possible as well, right? And that's why we run studies, and that's why we debate this in studies, and we have mechanisms that we think are either reasonable or unreasonable. We sort of hash those out, and then obviously they have to face reality at some point, right? And I guess to that point, when it comes to lockdowns, mask mandates, and those sort of measures that the public feels. I mean, the public doesn't really feel ivermectin. I mean, they do sort of, but not really. How are we going to really study that? Because I feel like now with this Ukrainian war, people have sort of forgotten about the pandemic, unless you live in a few certain areas in the country. Like I'm in middle America right now. And I mean, I saw a mask or a couple, but for the most part, strangely, the only place I saw them was at the Science Museum, but I haven't really seen them anywhere. And, but I read these reports from New York and from California. It's almost like it seems like a totally different world where kids are still wearing masks, toddlers. And I guess there has to be at some point a consensus on how things worked. And we have to arrive at that relatively soon, because I just saw a report came in through from a suburban city or school district in Kansas City, middle America. They've reinstituted mask mandates in their schools for not COVID, but for like other things. I mean, it's like this belief that masks are going to have effect on respiratory viruses and some, right? I mean, so I think at some point we do have to arrive at a proper consensus on whether these things worked or didn't, so we can develop policy when the next thing comes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that absolutely has to happen, but there does absolutely need to be a careful counting of what worked and didn't work, what was damaging, what wasn't damaging. I mean, we basically owe it to the dead, right? And I don't just mean dead of COVID. The lockdowns, I believe, led to the starvations of millions of people. The economic devastation on a scale that you only see basically during war. The lockdowns have led to a mass drive toward inequality. Schools closed, and it's who suffered. It's poor kids that suffered. It's poor kids that'll pay those costs throughout their entire lives, because you just don't make up 2 years of missed school just with a snap of a finger. The consequences are so grave for the lockdown. I don't see how it's possible to actually just move on without doing an assessment, and a very careful one, and arriving at some sort of consensus, like you said. If that assessment is done and led by the people who impose the lockdowns, and the public sees that, then there will be no trust in that assessment. Like there's some attempt to put together a COVID commission led by essentially lockdown proponents, like the Rockefeller Foundation, some big foundations actually put together an effort led by this guy named Phil Zelikow, who was the head of the 9/11 Commission. He actually contacted me like almost a year and some ago. So we wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, me and Martin Kulldorff, arguing that, look, we do need to have a commission, but the commission needs to be not led by the people who actually got their way with the policy. Those are the people that need to be assessed. And it needs to include people, including people like me who were critics, and lots of other people. It should be a very broad-based commission, but it absolutely needs to be something that's open, transparent, and so that the American people, the world people, can see that we've looked at everything. Because you can't have a cover-up on something of this scale. That you really cannot. The consequences of this have been too grave.
Yeah, I also feel like, much like the O.J. Simpson trial, you have to find jurors who are non-biased. And it's pretty impossible at this point. It's been so politicized, the lockdowns, mandates, that to find people who are of no opinion, I guess you'd say, they're people who've been on the moon, maybe in Antarctica. I'm not quite sure where they'd have to be, where they would not have formed an opinion at this point. And so it's going to be really hard to get a consensus. And I feel like it becomes very tribal. Like as soon as you say one way, you say it's one thing is true and not true, you've thrown your people maybe, or the other guy's people, under the bus. And so I don't know how you make that so it works out so that you can come to an honest opinion. Maybe I'm wrong, but I find it's going to be very challenging to find a framework that is going to be satisfactory to both sides, let's say, because again, everyone's sort of invested so much in this. I don't know how much time maybe just time has to pass. I don't understand. I don't know the answer.
It may take some time, but what I'm seeing, and maybe I don't know if you're seeing the same thing, Eric, is a lot of people who were sort of, well, in favor of these restrictions, in part because they were scared. That fear is dissipating, and many of them are starting to open their minds to whether it was actually right or not. I mean, a lot of them are fair-minded people. You can understand during the pandemic why they might have thought one way, just because they were. I mean, we were subject to like deep propaganda about how deadly the virus truly. It's deadly for old people, much less deadly for young people. A whole range of the efficacy of lockdown, a whole range of like sort of things that were not true were put forward as mainstream views. It was like this idea that if you question if you just measure the deadliness of the virus, like as I did with the Santa Clara study, that antibody study in the early days of the pandemic, that somehow that we were minimizing the virus. In fact, all we're doing is actually trying to measure exactly how deadly it is. It's one of these things where, like, I think as people move away from that, as the propaganda machine sort of turns to something else, I think people's minds will open, and I think I've seen that a lot of people are coming around to the view that maybe something went wrong. I don't know that it'll be possible to get a completely unbiased. I mean, you're right, Eric. I don't think any such thing, such a person exists. At least not one that's like I would want judging it.
Right, because I know what you want.
But I think I do think that that for many, especially those who were just in the middle, their minds are opening. The key thing is you can't have the people who are the architects of the lockdown be in charge of the evaluation of the lockdowns.
Right.
The architects and enforcers of the lockdowns are the ones that need to be on the dock for assessing whether their policies were right. And if they weren't right, then we need a historical repudiation of those policies. I frankly, Eric, would like to see lockdown become a dirty word. I want whenever people think of lockdown to recoil in horror at the thought, because the destruction that those policies have brought.
Yeah, I think that's the other half of that equation. I think one is did it actually accomplish what they had hoped, that it stopped the spread or minimized disease? And the second part, of course, is the secondary outcomes, right? And that's, I think, what was totally ignored during the debate, whether we should even have these economic lockdowns, mandates, et cetera. And you're an economist, so that's what you kind of do as a job, right? Like the unseen, right? What are the unseen consequences of whatever it is that we're doing? We have to measure those in some way and keep track of that, because there's a cost to everything. That nothing is without cost, whether it's your time or inconvenience at minimum, right? Or to your point earlier, educational costs from poor children, and usually ones who have of color, right? I mean, these are potentially really devastating, long-lasting effects, much more than long COVID. I think it's summers and more prevalent.
Yeah, I think the question of whether it was effective. I mean, we're going to be debating that in the scientific literature for a while. I've seen a whole range of studies. There's sort of two categories of studies I've seen. One which takes those models very, very seriously, and these models, these forecasting models, they're like agent-based models. What they do is they essentially have built into them the efficacy of a lockdown. In those models, if you take the little sims that populate them, keep them apart, they won't spread the disease each other. The disease doesn't stop spreading. You just push the disease off to later or whatever. And then you compare that against the real world and say, oh, look, we had fewer cases than predicted by the model, therefore the lockdown worked.
Right.
That's one class of papers. There's another class of papers that like trying to look at real world examples of places that lockdown versus didn't. And there you just get into big arguments over because we didn't run a randomized study. There's no randomization of lockdown. There's just correlations.
Right. Well, I mean, the data is really not you can't compare data from, say, Belgium with Morocco or Sweden with, Liechtenstein, right? I mean, how they test and how they determine all those things and record them. And we look in the United States, we have the same problem from state to state. We have disparity in sort of how people are did you die with COVID? Did you die of COVID? It's kind of foggy sometimes whether someone died because of COVID, is a secondary infection, whatever. And you can see how hard it is to compare these things. You can only kind of compare globally, like you can excess deaths and things like that. But of course, one could argue there are other reasons for excess deaths because of the lockdowns, because of social isolation, suicide, drug use, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Those are difficult comparisons, but the funny thing is, most of those papers that do real world comparisons, they find it's really hard to find a strong
Right.
correlation between lockdowns and good COVID outcomes. It just seems uncorrelated. Like, and now the question is why that would be. And it's really important that like people have intuitive sense that lockdowns ought to work. If I'm staying away from you, I'm not going to spread the disease to you, right? Why didn't they work then? And it's because society doesn't work like that. But the way society works is that we have a very unequal society. Maybe only 30% of people had jobs in the US where they could stay at home and not lose their jobs. The rest of the people basically had to work. And that's even more true outside the US, right? So in July of 2020, there was, I think July or August 2020, there was a seroprevalence survey done in Mumbai, in India. And in the slums of Mumbai, there was a 70% prevalence of the disease. In the rest of Mumbai, it was 20%. The lockdowns are a luxury of the rich. The ability to stay apart from each other, to stay sheltered, is a luxury of only a certain class of people, and they're not the majority of people in society. When you tell people to stay apart, it's very easy for us with jobs that allow us to not lose them. If we do that, to say that, oh well, why doesn't everyone do what I'm doing? I'm just being sensible. But for most people, they don't live in their living circumstances are not such that that's a reasonable, feasible thing to do. So you say a lockdown is going to work, but it won't work because the living circumstances of the vast majority of humans are not anywhere near able to comply with such a inhumane order. So I think that's why the lockdowns have failed to protect COVID spread. COVID is going to spread, and of course, there's animal reservoirs. There's all kinds of reasons why the lockdowns were never going to get us to zero COVID.
Yeah, I mean, zero COVID was pretty clear, I think, by April of 2020 that was an impossibility when it was already all over the world. I mean, once it's all over, it's a fantasy to think that you can, unless you think a vaccine is the first respiratory vaccine is going to be 100% effective at preventing transmission. I mean, I think there was that was fantasy. And I think that was pretty clear. And to your point about people changing their viewpoint, I definitely see clinicians, it has changed in sort of how they approach mask wearing is a good example. There were people who were zealots for masking that I saw in medicine who were, convinced that this is the route, and people who I think are pretty sensible people, but they were convinced that, and again, on some level, like you said, just like it's intuitively, you say, well, if you stay away from people, you can't spread a disease. If you wear a mask, it may not provide 100% protection, but it's going to provide some protection. If I eat onions for breakfast or for lunch and I'm wearing a mask, people don't notice my onion breath as much. So it must have some effect, right? I mean, I think and probably there is some very marginal benefit to these potentially, right? But it became pretty clear. I think I've seen definitely turning the tide the last few months. Again, I'm in the Midwest, so not in the Northeast or the West Coast, which may be different. But where I am, people are definitely much more blasé, or laissez-faire, maybe is a better word for it, about mask wearing. That yes, we are compelled to by the CDC now or the CMS, I think, within hospitals, healthcare settings. But no one really, I think, believes for the most part it's going to really do much. We see people wearing masks and they've got N95s on and they have a full beard. You're like, well, clearly that's not going to. I see people in the store with them and I'm like, I want to tell them that it's not effective, not because I'm being to be mean, but just like, if you really want their protection, you got to shave your beard. I mean, you can't obviously get a seal if you have hairs there. And we laugh about it, but it's like people don't realize that. They just think it's almost like this mythical sort of protection. But I want to kind of
honest, like I can't, I mean, I don't wear a mask with a seal when I'm forced to wear a mask. It's just really uncomfortable. And frankly, like, I think that's the vast majority of people. Like, and the virus is aerosolized. Once we understood the virus is aerosolized, aerosols, it's just, they stay in the air for a very long time. Your glasses get fogged up with them when you're wearing a mask. That fog has virus particles in it if you're sick, and it's sitting there. What was the end game with the mask? I just don't understand why we created this like enormous diversion of social energy to something that really had very little good evidence in favor of it.
I think, like many things, that there's the saying, don't just stand there, do something. And I think early on there was nothing to do, right? I mean, you could say, well, stay away from people, but that was not totally practical. It was not at all practical, in fact, because we need to eat. You can't go without eating for more than a couple of days if you really, so you have to go out and interact with people. And so you have to have, so it was a way of giving people something to do and to show that you were doing something and that you're being effective and you're a politician, you can never prove the counterfactual that it didn't work, right? I mean, because it's such an infectious disease. And then it became more, right? Then it became a talisman. It sort of became a symbol, just like wearing a MAGA hat, wearing a mask was suddenly this similar to sort of sorting the others and then yourself. And I think that's sort of I think that's kind of how it sort of evolves to what it is today, where it's more than just an infection protection. It's a value judgment.
Yeah, like they essentially like this messaging, my mask protects you, your mask protects me, as opposed to it doesn't my mask doesn't protect me, it protects you somehow. It weaponized empathy, right? So I care about you, and so therefore I must wear a mask. If I don't wear a mask, ipso facto I don't care about you. It's a dangerous message.
Sure. And it makes you, and it's a value judgment that makes you, that way saying you're better than them, right? I mean, that you're a bad person. And it's right. It's a good person, bad person, right? That's sort of a very simple way of setting it apart.
With so many things in COVID, right? So if you got COVID, the first thing anyone asks you is, well, why weren't you careful? Like, where'd you get it from? Who gave it?
How'd you get it?
Yeah. How'd you get it? I mean, as if like it's a respiratory virus. It just, I lived, therefore I got it. I just, and there was like, there's that, then there was like this distinction of clean, unclean, and so many things. So like masked, unmasked, are you being careful, not being careful? Are you vaccinated, not vaccinated, boosted, not boosted? I mean, all of these are essentially markers. This like we hijacked our innate fear of infectious disease, which, like if you go back to primitive societies, there's like this big distinction between clean and unclean. And in Western societies, we essentially, because we had made such progress against so many infectious diseases, it didn't really play it wasn't in the forefront of our minds that there were infectious diseases that could hurt us. And so when this disease came, and all of a sudden it was put on our face that infectious diseases are still out there, we're still human. People's fear centers, their sort of lizard brains took over. And this clean and unclean distinction came back is screaming, and it's led to so much of the social dissolution that we've seen the last 2 years.
Yeah, I think so. Well, my wife's a pediatrician, and one thing that she noticed, especially the big RSV spike that happened last summer after we had spoken, RSV was always around. It was always a danger to very small children, infants and to 1 or 2 year olds. And it was much, much more dangerous than really most infectious diseases for the most part that are certainly common. And parents just never worry about it. I mean, they would keep their kids from their grandparents. Maybe if someone's sick, the first few, I mean, that was kind of common, right? If someone's sick, you don't have them come hang out with your baby, right? And the people are always, and you totally be protective, mainly for RSV, I think for the most part, for other colds. But it wasn't until COVID happened and then RSV happens and then kids get really sick. I mean, a lot of kids went to the hospital because it was a really particularly bad RSV season. And my wife had, for once, the first time parents actually paid attention to her when she was talking about RSV, because before they'd never really paid attention to infectious disease. To your point, we kind of thought, oh, we'd beaten it. Infectious diseases are gone. And to your other point about my dad, always is trying to figure out where he gets cold from. I mean, goes back years. Like he's got a cold, he has to try and trace it. He's like an epidemiologist. He's tracing it back to like contact he had with it must have been one of his grandkids or some, like, it was never just, he's walking to Walmart and got it or something, right? It's always got to be someplace. And I'm the same, in some ways, in the same way, my wife just has a cold now, and we were out at a benefit a few days ago, about 3 or 4 days ago, and she started developing cold now. I don't know, maybe it's COVID, who knows? But you immediately think, well, how did you get it? Right? Like, was it I haven't had much contact except with our family, but to your point, there was no one sneezing, there's no one coughing, there's no one obviously sick, but it was a room of probably a couple hundred people. It would not surprise me if a few people had a cold of some sort of respiratory disease, and she just got it because it's aerosolized. And that is just the nature of infectious aerosolized, upper respiratory infections. That's just kind of what they are. And it's hard for us to accept that you can't, there's nothing you can do about it except not be human.
Yeah. I mean, it's a virus, not a sin. That's the key thing.
Yes, exactly. So how has your career changed? When I talked to you last June, it had obviously changed dramatically because you made the bold step of doing something. And my hat's off to you, because you were in a position, I mean, you're a tenured professor, so maybe you have a little less risk than people who aren't tenured, who are fighting for the professorship and at the academia. but it's still a huge risk and gamble to go against what clearly is the tide back in October. Your life has obviously changed. Uh, how has your career changed? I guess, in the last 2 years. I mean, since you kind of boldly stepped out and said, "Hey, I think we're maybe doing things wrong."
I mean, I have to say that I published like I think six or seven papers on COVID in the pandemic, and a few others, like a few others that trickled in or during the pandemic that were from projects that are, because publication takes a while. So it doesn't look like from the outside that my publications have slowed down, but my personal zeal to work on pure like scientific ideas that I had before, I feel has declined some. I've lost some faith in this process, just seeing how corrupted science has been during the pandemic. And I'm not sure what I need to do with myself. I mean, I think I have, before the pandemic, I used to work on science policy, actually. I did a whole series of papers looking at why, first measuring the extent to which biomedical scientists work on new ideas. And then evaluating the NIH, scientific journals, and scientists on sort of the reluctance they have to like actually publish and work on new ideas. Just in February 2020, I published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showing that the NIH actually had become much more conservative over time during Francis Collins' tenure. I still want to work on that. I think that's quite important. Like reforming science so that we go back to, like, I think now what's happened in science is that we reward people who have a lot of influence. Their ideas have a lot of influence. But that's essentially what a citation count is. It's the measure of influence. But we sort of punish people who work on crazy new ideas. It's not like the VC world. The VC world, someone works on a crazy new idea, they fail, they get another chance to work on another crazy idea, because you don't know what's going to work. In science, we punish people who work on new things, especially biomedical sciences. Like grants you get based on. I mean, I've sat on NIH grant review sessions for 20 years. You basically, if you're working on an idea, the assessment is on, oh, can this possibly work? But the assessment is made by people who have a vested interest in it, that idea not working, because then their ideas get sort of pushed to the side. I mean, I think I want to work on that. I think there's a lot of like interesting science to do about that, on that. Like, how do you measure novelty? What other aspects of science do you want to reward other than just novelty or influence? I mean, I would like to see a whole range of statistics on scientists, kind of like we do with baseball players, right? It's not just like, just like measure their RBIs or something. You want to measure a whole range of statistics. With scientists, it shouldn't just be how much influence do you have, how many citations did you get. It should be a whole range of things we want scientists to have, aspects of their how they work to have. And some scientists might be good at criticizing other scientists, doing replication work, thinking of crazy new ideas, testing out crazy new ideas. All of that should be rewarded, not just influence, even if the project fails. I think so in that sense, I kind of want to go back to that. That was part of my earlier career, but I was a health economist before, and there's some aspects of health policy I look at and go, well, this just seems boring to me right now. And I don't really, and a lot of the colleagues that I've worked with, some of them acted very, very poorly toward me in particular during the pandemic. I'm going to work really hard to try to forgive them, but I don't know if I can go back to just being friends with them the way I was. That just won't happen. So I think that to me, it's changed my perspective considerably. I mean, as a health policy, as a health economist, you always want to have some effect on health policy. Even as a French epidemiologist, I think you'd want that. In that sense, it's been very gratifying. I think I've had some effect on policy, although I think we lost the policy war in October 2020, unfortunately, with the Great Barrington Declaration. But I do think that if I can use my career to help reform how science works, so that it can become what it's supposed to be, which is this wonderful, amazing tool for discovering new things about the material world, where it's a conversation between bright people who's the passion they share is learning about the world. I would love to be able to do that, to help make science that kind of place again.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to your sabermetrics for scientists. When you have wins against replacement, I think we can say Anthony Fauci had a lot of errors this last year. He had a rough season in the infield. He muffed a lot of ground balls.
Bill James of science policy would be.
Yeah, you might want to be, even if you're a guy who just gets a bunch of walks, maybe the on base percentage is probably good enough. I don't know. Yeah, I think a lot of places you go with that. I do think, just to, again, back to the fact that I think people are viewing, at least clinicians are viewing masks differently. And I think viewing the infectious disease process differently with COVID. I think, the pendulums have swung quite a ways towards preventing discussion of ideas in academia. And my guess is people probably who were not fringe suddenly became fringe, and they're bothered by this. But not only just on the right, but I think, and I don't know if I'd even consider you right. I mean, you're probably right leaning, but even people like on the left, suddenly their ideas, their concerns about things were largely ignored with education and for children and things like that. And they recognize the risk, the danger of having this monoculture of thought. And so my guess is there'll be a broad coalition that will try and push things back towards a more robust discussion within academia. Because I just think it's pendulum.
Yeah.
And then at some point, and I would hope that you'd be part of that. I'm sure you would be part of that discussion when trying to get things back to the way they should be.
So we have this, I've been part of this initiative called the Academy of Science and Freedom. That's actually the mission of it, is to help that the environment within science to push back in a place where free discussion of ideas is just the norm. I mean, and that doesn't mean people won't be mad at each other or they won't argue with each other. In fact, that's just normal. Actually, frankly, the fun part of science. Actually, I wanted to talk about just briefly, just something you mentioned, which is really important. I mean, I always consider myself sort of kind of on the center right, but I didn't know what that meant, frankly. I'm an economist, so I kind of like markets. Does that make me center right? And what I've learned during the pandemic is that those labels don't really mean a ton to me. Like the people that pushed back, a lot of them were on my allies are on the left, actually. And I found I shared a lot of values with them. A lot of the people pushing for the lockdowns, actually, there were a lot of them on the left, and I think they acted in ways that were just not right. But also a lot of people on the right pushed for lockdowns. So it sort of cut across ideological lines, existing ideological lines, in a very strange way, right? You had a socialist government in Sweden saying no to lockdown. You had a conservative Republican governor in Florida saying no to lockdown. You have a progressive, is that the right word for Governor Newsom? I just call him a tyrant, frankly, because he kept my kids out of school.
Yeah, right.
He's on the left and he's pushing lockdown. I mean, so it just cut in a very strange way across the ideological spectrum. And I think this is actually an opportunity for right and left to get together. Actually, I mean, maybe I'm naive about this, but we all have a shared common interest in making science work properly.
Yeah, well, and I think it's important to recognize that it's easy when your guys are in power. It's easy to want to consolidate power, to have more control over things, but you always have to keep in the back of your mind, recognize that may be an issue later, right? Like you look at Canada, for instance, with the Freedom Convoy, and they had the truckers, and I had one of the truckers on my show who I knew through a friend of mine, and just talking about, the people got sort of locked down in their banking for donating to this. And whatever you think about the Freedom Convoy, whatever, I don't really care.
I love them. I'm thinking of getting a honk thing on for my wall.
But the point is that people were denied access to their financial means, and right, I mean, that's basically you could, I mean, in many ways, just kill them, because you could, if you suddenly take away all their money, and you might say, well, that's the right thing because those people were supporting the wrong, they're rebels, it's sort of like revolution, etc. Doesn't matter. But the point is that as Trudeau's in power, well, maybe 10 years from now, it's someone else who's got the entirely different. And now people who donated to Black Lives Matter or some other sort of left-wing causes, they would be subject to the same sort of, right? I mean, you have to always recognize that whatever power you grant someone could be used by the person who you like the least, right? And to not always assume it's going to be the person you like. And I think and we have very, very short memories in politics in the United States. And I think probably not just unique to us. I think it's a human condition. And I think you just have to always remember that is a risk, and to your point, what ideas and spreading at universities, I think we need to make sure that all ideas are open, because you don't know it shouldn't matter who's in power, who has the dominant thought. You should always have a dissident view should be there, because sometimes they are the ones that are important to know about. They might be right. And we have to have that discussion.
Well,
if it's not there, where's it going to happen?
Let me talk just very quickly about Stanford, but before that, I just say, like, it's not just the people that are right should be part of the discussion. Like, the point is, you don't know. So even people that are wrong help the discussion, because now the people that are right have an opportunity to sharpen themselves, so they understand why they're right more deeply. The person that's wrong then helps the person that's right. That's just like this is a classic John Stuart Mill kind of argument, but it's totally true. And so what we have, this very strong sort of bonus that comes from this kind of open discussion, because we push our knowledge about the way the world works, what the right thing to do is, what's morally just, what's unjust, into a better place, because we have this capacity to disagree with each other. Instead, what we've moved toward is this idea that there's good information and misinformation, and we have as a society an obligation to suppress misinformation, because it might mislead somebody into thinking something's wrong, something's right when it's wrong, or wrong when it's right. I think that's incredibly dangerous, and it's actually, even places like Stanford have embraced this, right? So there've been 100 or more grand rounds, 100 and some grand rounds since the epidemic started, and at Stanford, I've not been invited to give a single one. John Ioannidis has not been invited to give a single one. Probably the world's most cited scientist, probably, and frankly, one of the most creative, just a true genius, has not been invited to give a single grand rounds at Stanford. It is an absolute travesty for a great university to essentially to silence a discussion on such an important topic, especially when there are people who have a contrary view, and good reasons, I think, for those contrary views.
Yeah, well, and if you've watched the video on John Ioannidis, if no one's seen him, he is not what you call a firebrand. He's not fire and brimstone. I mean, he is very mild mannered, and I think just a sensible guy. And I think when it comes to disagreeing, it's very important to disagree, because it not only does it make your argument stronger, but I think you can refine things, and you may have errors in your thinking. And I think there's no better example. We all live this every day. If you're married, you disagree all the time, but you do it agreeably. And if you do it properly, you're a much better person. I think you have better ways of parenting, better ways of getting through life. And I think your life's just better if you find a balance to do that, because all the time I'm disagreeing with my wife on things, but it makes us better people, I think, and better ways of approaching our kids and life, because you see things through another set of eyes, and it makes you, and then then you go out and test those theories in the world. And I think, that's probably what you'd like, is you want to have someone who can bounce ideas off, who doesn't think exactly like you, because that would not make you grow as a human.
Yeah, I think we all, Eric, you and I think we agree on a lot, but I'm sure in conversation, I'd like find something you disagree, and frankly, that's a great opportunity. It's an opportunity for me to learn from you, and it's what makes science fun, is that open disagreement where we're not vilifying each other, we're just learning from each other. And when I've changed my mind about things in science, have been some of the best moments for me. My students teach me something, right? So they do a dissertation where the result didn't come out the way I thought it was going to come out, and I go, wow, this is right. And I changed my mind. I think those are really nice moments as scientists. And I think having this sort of replacing science with this propaganda engine is just a huge mistake. We have to fix that.
Yeah, I think we need to have some humility, both for voters and people who to that their government officials, the public officials, might be wrong, and that's okay. They make mistakes, but because there should be some openness. Like, if they got something wrong, they admit it and said, "Hey, you know what? That mask mandate didn't work. It clearly was not useful, and now we know, and so we're not going to do it again." Or we really did need to close on schools, whatever it might be, and that you have a back and forth within the public. I mean, the problem, of course, is that the political stakes, policy in government officials, people who are elected, I think that's a tough place to do that because the stakes are so much higher for being right or wrong, getting elected, losing your job, not losing the election. So that's why you need to have it in academia, in the, other places, and not trying to have the governor, go back, because they're less likely to admit that they're wrong. They might just, right, because they'll walk it back some other way. But, maybe that's human nature too, to some respect. Well, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford University, thank you so much for being on The Paradox. I enjoyed our conversation. Hopefully, next time we talk, there won't be a pandemic anymore in some way, or at least it won't be a new one. And maybe we'll return to some more sensible medicine. And I'd love to have chat about your foundation. Hopefully your organization really starts to make some inroads in getting better discussion in academia.
We maybe at some point we can have a conversation about sabermetrics. That'd be a lot of fun, Eric.
You would come up with sabermetrics for scientists. You are on, and it's like I'll promote the heck out of that. That'd be awesome. Thanks a lot.
All right, you take care.
Thanks for listening to The Paradox. If you like what the doc is doing, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher. And share the show with your friends. Become a supporting listener to get access to special bonuses at patreon.com/theparadox. Show notes can be found at theparadox.com.